Hi, this is Bracek, and we are recording this on August 8th, 2021. And I want to do a recap of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And much of this stuff I laid out actually in April and May of 2020, more than a year ago, but it's all coming to pass. And I just want to represent the logic of this whole thing and how it's being laid out. All right, so first of all, we have Wuhan, the most polluted city in the world by a very large degree, 11 million residents. And what happened? A guy in his 60s who was already in ill health died of a respiratory disease. And somehow that triggered a, full court press, that's a basketball term, investigation into why he died. Now that right away is a little suspicious and bizarre, because when 60-plus-year-old people that are already very sick die of respiratory diseases in the most polluted city in the world, that's really not medical news. But for some reason, it became medical news in China, and they did a test, and lo and behold, they claimed, and it's just a claim still, to have discovered a new virus never before seen, a SARS-like virus, the one we've been waiting for. How do you like that? And there was a lot of Hollywood and showbiz and make-believe, and suddenly people needed to be locked down, streets needed to be sprayed. This was the most dangerous thing, worse than Ebola, worse than AIDS, worse than radioactivity, just the most deadly thing that ever occurred in the history of humanity, except it wasn't. But that's how the story got started. And then after that story, then they went to Italy, northern Italy, and you have to understand that northern Italy is a heavily industrialized zone. It's got the most polluted air in all of Europe. That's number one. Number two, it has the oldest population in Europe. These are demographic facts. Number three, it has one of the smallest number of emergency medical care capacity in Europe. And I'm pulling these numbers from my memory, but it's roughly this. In Korea, they have 12 emergency hospital beds per unit. I wish I had my data here. In Italy, it's only 2 point something. So in other words, they have a very old population, they have an extremely polluted environment, and they have a very thin medical system, which they've been making thinner and thinner with each passing year. Every year, they have a catastrophic flu season, and there are people lined up in the hallways. If you didn't know this, it is not common for hospitals during normal flu seasons to get whacked and to not have enough beds for people and not have enough capacity to deal with the inflow. And I once, for another reason, ended up in a gurney in a hospital hallway for 6 hours. They put a drip in me, and I got no medical attention for 6 hours otherwise. And they finally deigned to talk to me. This wasn't even a major outbreak. This was just business as usual in a garbage American hospital in New York City. So anyway, they took the very predictable annual mini catastrophe that occurs every year in northern Italy in the winter, and they blamed it on the new virus. Okay, so now we had the Chinese hysteria, then the Italian hysteria, then we had the New York City hysteria. And we did an extensive interview with one of the nurses, one of the contract nurses that worked in the city hospitals during the dark days of COVID in New York City, and she is really clear those people were straight up murdered. People came in, these were poor people in poor neighborhoods, in city-run hospitals with brand new doctors that didn't know what they were doing, poorly supervised, who were scared out of their minds, who had very little experience, and they had rooms full of respirators, and they intubated everybody that walked in the door practically. including people who had asthma, including people that had panic attacks. And she said, oh, and they had no respiratory technicians to speak of, okay? But they did have a lot of inexperienced contract nurses who were making $10,000 a week paid by FEMA. Look it up. I know it's unbelievable, but that's the case. So they would take girls right out of nursing school that had never worked before, give them $10,000 a week, and shove them into these city-run hospitals in New York City with residents, which are brand new doctors, sometimes supervised, sometimes not, and they were just killing people left and right through incompetence. So that, and then of course they made up the story of the sirens. The sirens are all good. Well, New York City, I'm telling you right now, fire sirens, police sirens, and ambulances, but ambulances for all causes. So to say that there were a lot of sirens in New York City is like saying there's a lot of tea in China. It's just the most absurd thing. What else did they do? Oh, they discovered the mass graves that were well, there is an island, I believe it's called Hart Island, off of the Bronx. It's been Potter Field, where indigent people who can't afford to be buried are buried at city expense. This has been going on for over 140 years. There's nothing new. They even lied. They would say, oh, scores and scores of coffins, and then they would show the aerial drone photograph, and you could count. It wasn't scores and scores. And yes, they put them in wood boxes, and yes, they use a bulldozer, and they dig a hole, and they stack them up, and they bury them. That's how it's done. It's how it's been done for over 100 years, or at least since they got bulldozers. So that was a fraud. And then the next fraud was the containers parked outside of the hospital. That's all they were. Some of them weren't even refrigerated. You couldn't put bodies in those containers, right? And the ones that were refrigerated, what happened? Okay, when people die in a hospital, they have to get the body out of there. And what happens is a funeral home will send a hearse and pick up the body and bring it to the nursing home. Two things happened during the COVID catastrophe. Number one, all the nursing home, or all the funeral homes were shut down or on very short operation. I mean, it was a disaster for them. Number two, the flu season is always a problem for funeral homes in New York City. I don't know how it is in other parts of the world. Always a problem. And the third thing is, a lot of the people that died were poor, and their families had been destroyed by the lockdowns, and they did not have the money to give to a funeral home, even assuming the funeral home was operative, to go and pick up the body. So yes, if you don't pick up those bodies, it doesn't take too long for them to stack up. And you have to use other means to take care of the situation. So anyway, they stage managed New York City, and then the rest of the country lost its mind. Okay, that's how they put this thing over. If you'll recall, and we must always remember and never forget, this was supposed to be a 2-week pause, and that was in March of 2020. We are now a year and a half past that, or more, or less, give or take. So they went, it's the salami technique. They cut one slice, and then another slice, and then another slice. That 2 weeks turned into another 2 weeks, turned into a month, turned into indefinite, turned into rolling. And then they decided that everybody had to wear masks. And they knew damn well that these masks are useless. Surgical masks are only used during operations, and they're used to keep the doctors and nurses from accidentally spitting or breathing into an open wound. And actually some tests have been done, and they're not even very effective for that. But they're absolutely not effective for keeping respiratory diseases at bay. It's a total scam. However, it did make people very uncomfortable, worried, and fearful. And that was the goal. And the idea that people are wearing black masks and cloth masks and wearing the same surgical mask for days and days on end, this is lunacy. Never before in the history of medicine would that have been considered acceptable. People hanging their masks from their ear while they're having lunch, insane. People putting the masks out on the table while they're having lunch, insane. And yet that somehow became acceptable. So what was the end goal? Well, the end goal was what Bill Gates said it was going to be in March of 2020. Mandatory global vaccinations for the entire human population, and you will need to have a digital vaccine passport to be able to travel anywhere, to be able to, and he was just talking about crossing borders, but obviously it's been expanded to going into restaurants. That's what New York City is doing, going into music venues or entertainment venues. It will certainly apply to airline travel. It may well apply to let's see, airline travel. Well, it may well apply to entering any store. Okay, they check IDs. Don't bars check IDs for kids on Saturday night? That's a job. They know how to do it. Didn't they have people sitting at the front of many stores during the height of the insanity with the hand cleaner, demanding everybody clean their hands before they enter the store? Yeah. So that's going to be a new job in America, sitting by the door and checking everybody's digital passports, and it may well affect your ability to buy groceries. What's the purpose of this? To make sure everybody complies and everybody gets this vaccine. Gates laid it out with crystal clarity in March of 2020. He said exactly how it was going to be, and it's turning out exactly the way he said it was going to be. Now, as I record this, after a period of some return of sanity, many people are again losing their minds over the variant. Okay, and we've done videos on that, hearing from top virologists. This variant thing is absolute bullshit. There are a gazillion variants of every virus, and there's nothing new about that. And this particular one is no more deadly and maybe not even more transmissible. It's just a little different. But they are ginning it up to create panic. And now we see people, at least where I live, putting their masks back on. And in New York City, they have commanded restaurants and music venues to ban anybody who attempts to enter who does not have documentation of being vaccinated. So as the idiot criminal mayor of New York likes to brag, it all starts with New York and then it rolls out across the country. And that is indeed how it will go down. And clearly they want to go after they want to do a bunch of things. And I said this way back, early 2020, this was never about one shot. This was about a lifetime of booster shots. And we're not talking about one in a blue moon. We're talking about every year, maybe multiple times per year. In other words, anytime they declare a bio-emergency, they're going to crank up a vaccine and you will be required to take it. That's the plan. That's always been the plan since day one. And the FDA, God bless its corrupt little heart, even they, so far, as of this recording, have not been able to go along with it. They have not, as of today, August 9th, 2021, approved any of these vaccines. And the reason they haven't done it is the safety trials are not complete. Safety trials take time, and you can't race the time. You can't erase the time. They've got to run their course. And for whatever reason, the FDA, at least as far as today, is behaving ethically and not giving approval to these vaccines. They are being authorized for emergency use. What does that mean? It means there's an emergency that's dire and there is no other possible treatment available. Well, when we look at the death rates, at least where I live, and in a lot of places in this country, they may talk about active cases based on tests, but in terms of hospitalizations and deaths, it ain't happening. So there is no emergency. That's number one. And number two, if people do get this particular disease, there appears to be many safe, effective, low-cost remedies for it. Some of them are by prescription, and some of them are over the counter. How do you like that? So the emergency use authorization is based on fraud. So they want to get the resistors to accept the vaccination, which is an experimental medical procedure. And they're doing that they're going to do that by making life difficult for people. Right now, It is honor system. If you claim you've been vaccinated, you can walk into stores without a mask. Okay, they are going to, once they get their vaccine passport system in place, they will be checking. And if you do not have the passport, you will be required to wear a mask when you go shopping. So they hope that by making people's lives absolutely miserable, they will give in and accept the shot. But what they're really going after is the kids. Okay, and we're going to play a little video here from Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins is one of the roots of all evil in this thing. We've got a guy named Paul Rothman, who's the CEO, and Bill Moss, who's part of one of a million pro mandatory vaccine think tanks. And something that you need to understand that I'm kind of new intuitively, but now understand thoroughly, and when Bobby Kennedy's book finally comes out, it's going to be crystal clear. There are thousands of people whose employment depends on pushing this scam. This is not three guys in a cave in Afghanistan. This is doctors. This is professors. This is government officials. This is Pentagon people. This is pharmaceutical people. This is journalists. I mean, it is thousands and thousands and thousands of people have been working on this, some of them for years and years. I'll give you a little preview of the book. It's not really news, but they have been running virus war game scenarios. Everyone's aware of the one that happened just before COVID broke out. Well, they've run dozens of them for nearly 20 years, maybe actually a little more than 20 years. And each time they run one, it's like a recruiting and training session for new operatives. And they have run tens of thousands of people through these scenario trainings. So that's the mechanics of how this thing seemingly sprung out full-blown from nowhere. It didn't come from nowhere. They've been rehearsing it for 20 plus years. And they have thousands and thousands of operatives, most of them useful idiots. Some of them really sinister people. They tend to be the ones at the top. But thousands and thousands of useful idiots and millions of people that have been willing to go along to get along. And that's how this thing worked. In any event, we're going to play this clip from Johns Hopkins. It's clear the target for this is children. Okay? And you'll see how they're going to justify it. And I'll tell you right now, but you can hear it from their own lips in a few minutes. They're saying that because we can't vaccinate the whole world, that means that there'll be variants a-brewing non-stop that will end up on our shores. So number one, we've got to raise, $1 trillion or so to put this vaccine into the arms of every living person on Earth, which is what Bill Gates said he wanted to do back in March of 2020. It should not be news. It's news to the news media, but it shouldn't be news. It's certainly not news to longtime brass check listeners. All right, so that's one of their baloney stories, that we're going to have endless variants because we can't vaccinate the world. Okay, but the other story, and this is really sinister, they're saying we can't have herd immunity until we vaccinate the children. Why? Because children represent 25% of the population. And you can't get herd immunity until you get 80%. So by not having the children vaccinated, we will perennially be in a state of non-herd immunity. So we got to get that vaccine ready for the kids. And parents, you just have to give your children over to the process. And we'll see how many of them are willing to do that. I'm afraid millions are willing to do that. Every time I see a small child in a mask, I want to take the parent. Well, I can't say what I would do, what I would like to do. Not happy to see it. Let's just put it that way. Anyway, here's a chart. Take a look. This is mentions of the word variant on Google, and you will see there wasn't a whole lot of mention of that word in people's search activity until late May. And then suddenly the variant became everybody's obsession, a growing obsession. Well, this clip that I'm about to show you appeared 2 weeks, give or take, 10 days before variant mania began. Now, the actual number of views for this thing, very small, but the people that viewed it, because it was shown live to many, many, many doctors and many, many, many journalists and many, many, many government officials, this is where the variant cock and bull story was floated in a big way. This was sort of the launch of the story. We actually, I always aspire to catch these propaganda operations in their infancy, and here it is. So you've seen the chart. You can see the spiking of discussions of variant on YouTube, on Google, and now you're going to hear the guys that help sell it. Johns Hopkins, and you have to know that Johns Hopkins is completely in the pocket of Bill Gates to the tune of tens and tens of millions of dollars, as well as Michael Bloomberg. And this Bill Moss guy is one of their point men for mandatory vaccinations of the population. So here's the clip.
If we start seeing these breakthrough infections with variants, then the game changes, and we'll need to not only focus on children and those who mistrust vaccines, but getting third doses out to everyone. And that's not going to be a simple logistical operation.
Wow, Bill, that's really helpful. So the talking about variants starts to think about vaccines around the world, because as you know, one of the concerns people have is as this virus continues to replicate in populations around the world, new variants will come up that may be troublesome, as you described. Talk a little bit about vaccine shortage. So the U.S. seems to, most people are predicting everyone who wants a vaccine will get it almost, pretty soon. And the question is, you start to look around the world, tell me what you think about vaccine shortages around the world, the concerns you have about that, and ways that we and others might help address it.
The United States, and I think justifiably, has focused on its own population. Up till now, we had a terrible outbreak pandemic in the United States, really have led the world in cases and deaths. I think it's justifiable that we've focused on getting our own population vaccinated, and obviously the U.S. government invested heavily in the research and development of these vaccines. But we're at a point where the United States really needs to play a bigger role in global vaccine inequities. And we're seeing, obviously, really tragic consequences of the pandemic in India right now. But India is not alone. There are other countries, Brazil, Turkey, that are seeing extremely high cases. And so now that we've kind of reached this point where more than half of adults in the United States are vaccinated, or at least have received this one dose, we need to turn our attention globally. There are gross inequities in COVID-19 vaccine access globally. Some recently reported numbers, 81% of available COVID-19 vaccines have gone to high-income countries, and less than 0.3% to low-income countries. And this needs to change. The big mechanism for doing this, for getting vaccines, particularly to the low and middle-income countries, is something called COVAX. This is a coalition led by the World Health Organization, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And they're really trying to lead this charge to get procure vaccines, leverage the buying power of this coalition, and get vaccines to the low and middle income countries of the world. But it's been a slow rollout. There are a number of countries still that haven't even vaccinated a single individual. The goal is to provide sufficient number of vaccine doses so that all countries can at least target 30% of their population and the high priority groups, the healthcare workers, those who are most vulnerable from severe disease. But a lot more needs to be done. I think we've seen, the U.S. Under the Biden administration has re-engaged with the World Health Organization. They've committed $4 billion to COVAX to help procure vaccines for low-income countries. But that needs to be where our focus is, and not just out of humanitarian reasons, although I think that's sufficient, but for selfish reasons. That's how we're going to, protect the United States. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see imported viruses, and I hope not. But as long as there are, large transmission of viruses in other parts of the country, as you said, there's the potential for emergence of new variants, and I just hope we don't see variants that really can escape the immunity provided by our current vaccines. I sometimes fear that people think that, we reach this magical threshold and all of a sudden the virus is going to go away. That's not how herd immunity works. It just reduces the probability of transmission. Now, coming back to your question, can we reach, let's just say, take that for face value, 80, 85%. We know in the U.S. population, 25% of our population is children. And so we're not going to achieve that until we start vaccinating children. And we have this problem or challenge, I'll say, of many people not wanting to be vaccinated. That's a complex issue. We kind of lump it under this term vaccine hesitancy, but there are many reasons why people are reluctant to get vaccines. Some are adamant, and no matter what we do, no matter what kind of communication strategy we have, we may not change their mind. There are other people who are on the fence, and who I think we can provide information.